So welcome everybody. Welcome to our last Enabling Water Smart Communities webinar of this series. It says it's the spring series, but I appreciate we're in summer now, so it did extend a little bit into summer. So this webinar is going to focus on insights from our community-led stewardship work. My name's Kat Moncrief. I'm at CIWEM, the Chartered Institution of Water and Environmental Management, and we've been closely involved in the broader Enabling Water Smart Communities project, and I'm going to host today. Before we get into the detail, I'm just going to run through a few housekeeping points. So this meeting is going to be recorded. If you've got any problems with that, then please do let us know. There's no obligation for you to turn your cameras on or microphones on. That's just for the speakers. If you experience any technical issues and need help, then please raise your hand and use the chat feature on Zoom to let us know what the problem is. We will take your questions at the end of the presentation. If you would like to put a question or make a comment about the talk, then please use the Q&A facility on Zoom. Okay, so these are our speakers today. So we've got me, who's just helping to chair the session, and then we have David Alcock from Anthony Collins Solicitors. So this is, can you hear me okay? Just want to check the sound. All okay? Yeah, okay. So this is a purpose-based law firm with roots in Midlands and the Northwest. And they've been doing a lot of work around community stewardship models and have been working with CLTN, the Community Land Trust Network, for over 15 years on this type of thing. And then we've also got Tom Chance with us from the Community Land Trust Network, Chief Executive, and they have been leading this work, this community stewardship work for the Enabling Water Smart Communities project. Okay, and then this is the agenda. So I'm going to do a very short introduction to the Enabling Water Smart Communities project, and then I'm going to hand over to Tom and David. Tom's going to talk through, give an overview of the stewardship work stream and its key findings, and then we'll have David and Tom talking through some of the key insights from the latest report, and then the work that David's been doing with the legal toolkit and with the kind of guidance notes around that to respond to some of those issues. And then we should have 15 minutes for Q&A at the end, maybe a little bit more. Okay, so just very quickly on Enabling Water Smart Communities. So for those of you that don't know, this is an innovation project exploring the relationship between water management, community practices, and housing development, and its aim is to unlock opportunities for the delivery and stewardship of water smart housing. As you can see, there are a huge number of different organisations involved in the project. It's led by Anglian Water. We have other water companies involved, but we also have housing developer involved, and then key government departments like the Environment Agency, Homes England, Ofwat, DEFRA, and a number of consultancies. And then it's also been really great to have a community-based organisation, CLTN, as part of the programme board as well. And the project is all about addressing the shared challenges faced by the water and housing sectors, and you can see that these are illustrated here on this slide with those news articles and stats. But essentially it's those challenges around too much water, too little water, too polluted water, which is preventing homes from being developed. So the project is trying to address those issues head on, and it's doing that by evolving the concept of water smart housing. And this graphic just gives a little bit of an illustration of what we mean by a water smart community or water smart housing. This is actually taken from a playbook that we're developing, which will help share and it sort of curates and shares a lot of the outputs we've produced as part of the project. But this illustration really shows some of the different components of a water smart community. And I would just pick out the fact that it's very much about an integrated approach, so addressing those issues of too little water, too much water, and too dirty water in an integrated way, and also integrated between different organisations as well. It's also about taking a kind of nature-based approach where we can to addressing those issues, so nature-based solutions like rain gardens, blue-green roofs, using those as much as possible to capture and filter water. And it's also about the community, and that's what we're focusing on today. The Water Smart Community is about the community being absolutely central, and I think this is captured here really, which is a sort of definition of what we mean by water smart community. So it's a place where water is central to the design of the place, but it's also not just about the hardware, it's about the software, it's about the people, where people can embrace the principles of water stewardship and where they are empowered by the assets and systems to use water wisely and with care for the environment. Okay, and I will stop there and hand over to Tom to introduce the Community-Led Stewardship Programme.
Thanks, Kat. So we worked with United Utilities on where stewardship fits into this, and thinking of that graphic Kat shared of all the different assets that you might have in a place, the question becomes who's going to look after all of that once it's built? And also, in what way is the community involved? Because separate work done through some of the academic work on the project established a clear evidence base around the improved outcomes that you get if communities are really actively volunteering and getting involved in maintaining and engaging with the blue and green infrastructure in a place. And that could in turn help them with using and learning and understanding how to use stuff that's in their own home as well. So the first two phases of our work on this project, which we've done and covered in a previous webinar, were about looking at existing stewardship models that exist currently. About 80% of new large-scale sites are seeing assets put into different forms of private management company currently. The government, after a Competition Markets Authority investigation, has committed to trying to reduce the prevalence of those because the CMA concluded they're really bad for consumers. And we've also established that there's real limitations in the ability of those stewardship models to be able to effectively manage the complexity of water infrastructure and then miss an opportunity to kind of get that level of community engagement. Our question was, is there something in the community land trust model and other kind of forms of community stewardship in which would be able to better steward these sorts of assets and better meet the aspirations of the Water Smart Communities project? We then worked to design a blueprint to describe what would you need to do at each stage of the development process, from the very initial point of site allocation in the local plan, or landowner bringing a piece of land forward, through master planning, the construction, long-term stewardship of management, and then to the end of life, in order to effectively embed a community-led stewardship model that could do a good job of looking after and designing the right and then looking after these assets. So as I said, there's a previous webinar and on the EWSC website, insight reports describing all that work. What we've subsequently done is tested this against a couple of real-world examples. One is a garden village site, which is on site today, and some of the homes are already completed. A lot of the infrastructure is completed. It's the final phases of that will be happening over the next couple of years. Another is an urban regeneration scheme at an earlier stage, and we ran stakeholders in both those projects through the blueprint process to identify, does that blueprint help them in their decision making, and also commissioned some detailed reviews from different professional perspectives to look at what has been achieved in the Garden Village case and see where the lessons are and what was good, what was bad about it, basically, and to turn that into a set of insight reports. And then to relate those to the legal tools, the advice notes that David will speak about, which kind of give some guidance to different professionals within the system about how you would implement this. So I'm going to just very briefly summarize some of those insights, but as I say, the full report gives you the detail on it. So if you go to the next slide, please. Thanks, Kat. So the first insights, not very surprising, but we sort of describe a progressive dilution through the 10 plus year process by which a large development comes to completion in the aspirations and the standards around water. And water, as we understand through the wider project, is not the highest of priorities. It's easily overlooked in the planning process. From the planning process, the sort of standards set out in the local plan for it didn't really reflect the aspirations of the Water Smart Communities project, and the community and the master planners involved in it didn't adequately consider opportunities for this, and those weren't then embedded in the outline planning consent and in Section 106 considerations. So from very early on, you're starting to miss opportunities where actually the community would have had an aspiration to have more things like site-wide water recycling. Then as the project goes forwards, these are always complicated projects and the sort of fragmented governance and what is the relationship between the role of the water company, there's a NAV involved, and the CLT as the eventual steward of these assets, who owns which assets, who would be responsible for which one, makes it complicated to be able to ensure that the aspirations are held through the whole process and people don't find reasons to edit them out. There's really nobody that is accountable for ensuring that the water smart vision is carried through all those different stages of a project up to long-term stewardship. And then issues arise like insurance. So the CLT was looking at whether it could not quite retrofit, but kind of crowbar in some alternative water technology into the homes that they will own in this development later in the process. But it was creating insurance issues and warranty issues with the home builder and the NHBC, and so they had to drop those aspirations. They couldn't solve them in time. It was going to hold up the development, and so they had to drop it. Also, unclear funding arrangements, where in this case, the community land trust will own all of the open space, blue and green infrastructure, freehold of a health centre, and a third of the affordable homes. It has a robust financial model around how it's going to discharge its duties in general, but not clear about how it would finance any additional cost of water infrastructure like site-wide rainwater or grey water recycling. And then finally, there's cost and viability. And this is a scheme that is being completed at a difficult point in the development cycle with high rising costs, stagnant sales values, things get cost and value engineered out. In this case, actually, the sales are very strong and they're doing well compared to the wider local market. But all these sorts of factors, as with any project, as with any hopes, you can lead to a dilution of the project as you go along. And so one of the things we looked at, and then this passes over to David, is in a way, how do you use local plans and procurement and other levers to avoid this dilution and to lock things in a way that is realistic and feasible and doesn't kind of lead to viability challenges later? So I'll pass over to David.
Thanks very much, Tom, and good morning, everybody. And that's a picture of me. But crucially, it has my email address on it. Should anybody wish to use that or to raise any of the legal issues that I'm going to talk about. So we can skip over that slide, please. Great. So just a very brief word about us. So Anstey Collins is a law firm. We are historically based in the Midlands. We're now based in the Northwest in addition. So we have key offices in Birmingham and Manchester and a new hub in London. We work across England and Wales for this work. We've been doing neighbourhood-based work and work around stewardship, community-led stewardship models for about 35 years now. And we've been developing a model which is neither a wholesale adoption by the local authority, nor the use of traditional management companies, as Tom touched on in the intro, but something in the middle, where there's a much more purpose-led approach looking at charitable or quasi-charitable vehicles, which involve local residents and are accountable to them, but actually have a broader involvement and a broader set of stakeholders, but crucially have a very clear purpose, which is the long-term benefit of the wider community. And we've set up a number of these bodies now. And so when we talk about stewardship, that is what we mean. We mean the process whereby public assets in the context of new developments are both built but then maintained and looked after in a high quality way for the long term in the interests of those who live there. So that's what's when we talk about stewardship, that's what we mean. And in this context, what we worked with Tom and colleagues on was some technical notes looking at some of those different aspects of the law that Tom's mentioned, and particularly the question of, well, how, if you wanted to secure water conservation, water smart community outcomes, how could you use those different aspects of the legal framework to achieve those? So we can go to the next slide, please. The first aspect we looked at was the whole question of procurement. When we talk about procurement, we're simply talking about the process by which public bodies and others buy and sell outcomes in this context. What our note points out is that when you're looking at procurement process, it's very important, first of all, to identify who is doing the procuring, because they'll be subject to different legal requirements. Local authorities and housing associations are regarded as contracting authorities for the purposes of the public procurement regulations. They then have a very clear set of expectations on them. Developers and indeed community stewardship bodies are not subject to those regulations in the same way. With any procurement, you need to identify where it falls and whether it's a sufficiently valuable contract to fall within the scope of the full regulations. So the process of analysing what are you procuring here. So we can go on to the next slide, please. And in that context, there are a number of, if you like, procurement levers that you can achieve to secure water conservation outcomes. The first is being very clear about what it is that you are seeking in the way of outcomes, and that can link back to planning policy, which I will briefly talk about next. Then there are stages in the process that allow you to seek the outcomes that you're looking for if you're a public body and you are looking to secure a water smart community approach. Some of those stages are on the slide, but just to draw your attention to a couple of them. I mentioned that procurement laws are now enshrined in the Procurement Act 2023, which is the post-Brexit legislation. One of the procedures in there, called the competitive flexible procedure, allows you to engage with the market, if you're a public body, to look at how you might co-create solutions to a particular set of issues that you want to achieve. So it would be open to a local authority or another body that was looking to procure water smart community outcomes to actually go to the market and say, well, how could we do this in practice? How can you help us co-create a solution? And then when you come to the process of awarding a contract, we think that using the most advantageous tender award criteria under the Act allows you to actually award marks for the achievement of water conservation criteria, provided you've set them out in your requirements for that contract. So it's important all the way through. I think what I'll be indicating is that it's very important to start with the end in mind so that you are designing the legal elements to whatever you are proposing, being clear about what you want to achieve in the way of water conservation outcomes and water smart communities from the outset. Tom's mentioned that there are some challenges to manage here in relation to the impact potentially on viability and on long-term maintenance costs of, for example, grey water infrastructure, I'll come back to in a second. But there are also some incentives for developers. Ofwat have set out in their environmental incentives common framework some permissions around how developers can where they are connecting new properties to water and wastewater networks, build in grey water recycling, and actually that in that that they can achieve environmental incentives in that regard. So that's all worth looking at. Okay, next slide, please. Turning to planning, which I mentioned I would talk about. Again, here I think the overarching message is, I'm just looking for my note which has disappeared, is about achieving what you want to down through the different elements of the planning system. The planning system begins with the National Planning Policy Framework, which is set by government. And the current NPPF makes specific reference to the planning system supporting the transition to net zero, including, crucially, water scarcity, and talks about plans taking a proactive approach to mitigating and adapting to climate change, including taking into account the long-term implications of planning decisions for water supply. The NPPF is supported by government planning practice guidance, which makes specific reference to water and water infrastructure. So the national framework permits, in a planning context, and it encourages in a planning context, plans to take account of water scarcity and the implications of development for water supply. Next slide, please. The key issue then, if you are a local authority and you want to encourage water conservation approaches in development, is to embed those policy aims in your local plan. Local authorities, if you like, underneath the umbrella of the NPPF, have a responsibility to develop local plans that cover their area there, and that will continue to be the case when we go through local government reorganisation. It's really important that in the local plan, where an authority wants to encourage water conservation outcomes, there is specific reference to that in the local plan, because what it enables you to do is to create a consistent policy framework that allows the public sector to say, this is what we want to see in the context of development. It's supported by the NPPF, and that gives you a consistent approach at all levels through the planning process. And then in relation to a specific development, it allows local authority to say to developers, look, this is what we are aiming to see. We made that clear in our local plan. We expect that to be reflected in the planning applications that you bring forward, which is one of the primary areas of leverage that local authorities have in relation to securing the kind of outcomes that we're talking about. And that, I think, is back to you, Tom, at this stage. Excellent.
Thanks, David. So I mentioned this in my previous slide. If you've then got those frameworks in planning and procurement, the kind of the fundamentals of how a project comes forward correct, one of the questions we looked at is there a need for something that was described as a water guardian, which would be present through these processes to protect some of the aspirations around water from some of the issues I then described around things like value engineering, spec changes, being able to see off and address any insurance issues and so on, and to help bring greater clarity to the governance and ownership and funding and maintenance arrangements where there are going to be relationships with water companies and NAVs and others in there. What we didn't say is, we didn't get to the point of is defining, well, who would that water guardian be? And one of the interesting findings from the study, particularly of the CLT development in Cambridge with the Garden Village, was to a certain extent the Community Land Trust and the District Council were playing that role. And one of the reasons, although I've described some of the shortcomings of it, that in other respects it is a very good development, and there's going to be a strong chance of a fairly water smart outcomes in terms of that. That's really because there has been the consistency of the District Council and the community through the process in advocating for and trying to hold these things as part of the process. And the question really is, how could they be, or how could others working with them bring in the necessary technical expertise? And one of the reviews we commissioned was from a company specializing in water reuse systems, who was able to look and advise the CLT on stuff they didn't know themselves, and the District Council didn't know about which technologies might be potentially viable and what the cost might be and so on. So how do you kind of bring the necessary skills and understanding into whatever that guardian role is through the process in order to protect these things? And how do you then address the governance question, which is then back to David?
Thanks very much. So in this context, we looked at the different, if you like, the different players in any particular development. And in order to understand who can do what and where this water guardianship role might sit, I think it's necessary to understand, first of all, what the water companies themselves are able to do and what they are not able to do. The provision of water is heavily regulated So you have, not only do you have Ofwat, who are the Water Services Regulation Authority, you also have the Environment Agency, the Drinking Water Inspectorate, and others who together oversee the provision of water. Now, we know that the government is planning to abolish Ofwat. It remains to be seen at the moment what powers the new regulator will wield and how it will function in practice. But at the moment, Ofwat is continuing to be in place. The obligations on water companies are to supply, as those who from water companies will know, are to supply clean, wholesome drinking water and bill customers for that provision, and in that to comply with economic regulation by Ofwat, environmental regulation by the Environment Agency, and drinking water standards set up by the Drinking Water Inspectorate. What water companies are specifically authorised to do is to set and levy charges for wholesome water supplied through their networks. Now, the obligation in relation to wholesome water is interesting because that is drinking quality water, which meets the conditions set out in regulations. What became clear to us is that I think there are some issues around doing anything else if you're a water company. So water companies said to us, our obligation is to supply drinking water. That's what we do. We don't want to get involved in grey water infrastructure. We don't have the powers to get involved in grey water infrastructure at the moment. And we don't want to get involved in the kind of some of those water smart community aspects that Kat was outlining at the start. Not because we don't want to, but we don't have either the powers or the ability to charge for that. And that made us go and rethink some of that. Let's go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So we started to think about the role of water guardianship as Tom has outlined it. And I think that role divides across local authorities in their capacity as planning organisations, and then potentially stewardship bodies in their role as looking after the community infrastructure in relation to a particular development. For local authorities, there is that role I've outlined previously in relation to making sure that the policies are lined up through the planning system and through their procurement to make sure that they are achieving, they're set up to achieve the outcomes that we want to see achieved. That role, if you like, then passes when we get to implementation and management to the stewardship body, which can be created with an inclusive governance model, as I've mentioned, to collectively, privately own the grey water infrastructure in the context, for example, of a particular development. And then we started to look at the question of funding, which I'll come back to in a moment or two. I think in relation to the achieving of water smart community outcomes, what we identified here is that those who want to acquire homes in such a development will necessarily need to be willing to buy into what I've described here as a water asset solution, because it will necessarily become part of the fabric of how that community is set up and owned through the funding of the stewardship vehicle. And through that stewardship vehicle's role in owning those local assets in relation to any particular development. Back to you, Tom, I think.
Thanks, David. So the remaining challenge we looked at was the funding gap. And although work on the assets work stream of EWSC identified that beyond a certain scale, particularly 100 homes, it doesn't cost the earth to put in high quality water infrastructure. We are in a context in which housing development is not viable in many parts of the country currently, and there's a lot of regulatory costs and a lot of other sort of environmental demands on housing development. And that can very quickly lead to one of the reasons why water technology could then be squeezed out, not wanting to put in dual pipe systems, not wanting to put in site-wide grey water and rainwater harvesting systems. And that, as I suppose water companies will put it, water is relatively cheap. There's no great pressure for the management company or stewardship body to keep this stuff going. They could just switch it off and save themselves the expense of having to run this stuff, and residents can still get their drinking water from the water company. So there's a bit of a puzzle around how do you bring other innovations in to better finance this infrastructure. One thing that we looked at is a proposal with a sort of nickname of the Kepler model, in which you separate out the financing of the land and infrastructure from house building. And so in the case of the Garden Village, that was promoted up to planning by the district council's housing company, but then a volume house builder steps in to start to acquire the land, to do all the work on the infrastructure and to start to build the houses. And they are carrying on their balance sheet the cost of that land and infrastructure, and essentially requiring a profit on the cost of that land and infrastructure through short-term development financing, which they then recoup by selling homes to people. And there's a model in which you could instead finance that land and infrastructure over a very long time separately, and the house builders are just there to build the homes themselves. And the lower financing cost over long-term financing for that land and infrastructure would be more cost effective and would therefore free up some money. So we commissioned a small study to run the numbers on the Garden Village development and on the potential, what if there were a further phase of development, and it indicates the potential for 14% reduction in the cost of the land and infrastructure development, which would easily then provide the headroom to be able to meet the higher standard of infrastructure that we would be looking for in this water project, and would have the helpful corollary of also vesting that land and infrastructure clearly in the Community Land Trust. We also considered some previous work which United Utilities had led, looking at alternative models. On the right here is capturing the summary of that. This Kepler model wasn't included in that study, but there were a number of other market-based models of environmental credits, looking at water bill rebates, different sorts of funding that could be used. None of these are yet really market ready, and so there's definite fertile territory in looking further at these alternative financing mechanisms, which we combined with the current standard financing mechanism, which is for the stewardship body to basically just levy estate charges on residents as an annual charge in order to pay for the maintenance and upkeep of infrastructure. So there's a need to pilot some of these and to better understand the long-term liabilities and insurance gaps that might be involved with some of these alternative models that could lead to better outcomes in future. But for the moment, we have the mechanisms we have, which are well understood and which are market ready, which then David will speak about.
Thank you very much. So we go on to the next slide. The final area that we looked at was the funding of stewardship bodies. Stewardship bodies, in a general sense, will, when you are approaching how you devise a stewardship solution for a particular development, there'll be a range of potential sources of income and a range of assets that might pass into what are non-statutory bodies that will be taking ownership of assets. Some of those assets might themselves enable you to generate income. So sometimes community buildings, commercial buildings even may pass to the stewardship body, and some of those may actually be income generating, and that will help contribute to the overall costs of long-term maintenance and management. Some of those assets will simply be a long-term cost and will require a separate funding mechanism. Typically, that funding will come, at least in part, from those who buy homes in the development. And in order to achieve that, there are a couple of ways of making sure that you can secure contributions from residents, and our note on using service charge arrangements to fund grey water infrastructure outlines this as an example. The use of service charges, if you draft the documentation correctly, allows you to use funds from service charge not only on, if you like, hard edge grounds maintenance, but also maintaining community assets. We've seen service charges set up to fund district heating schemes, to fund other water related community assets. So there's no problem with constructing your service charge to enable funding to be spent on those elements of maintenance. There is a technical issue around how you secure contributions from freehold properties. And in the main, there are two routes that people use to allow you to do that. One is the use of an estate rent charge mechanism, which requires a particular deed to be drafted that the property owner enters into alongside the normal conveyancing documentation, which creates a specific obligation which is linked to the land to the stewardship body, which will be specified in the estate rent charge documentation, and that runs independently of a change of hands. It's linked to the land, to the property, and creates an ongoing obligation in respect of that dwelling to contribute to the stewardship body. Estate rent charges are, without wishing to go into overly technical detail, are slightly controversial because of some of the rights that come with them, with the rent charge owner. That's all under review at the moment, but the alternative is to have a deed of covenant as part of the transfer documentation, whereby alongside confirming that you're going to pay the funds for the house that you're buying, you sign something to say that you will covenant to pay payments to the stewardship body in relation to service charge, and also that should you in the future sell your house, you will ensure that the successor purchaser will again enter into a deed of covenant directly to the stewardship body, and that becomes a necessary part of the conveyancing process, and someone has to certify that's been done. It's slightly more clunky than an estate rent charge because you have to do that deed of covenant mechanism each time property changes hands. But either way, there are mechanisms to secure service charge income. We should flag at this point that service charges for freehold accommodation have up to now not been subject to the same rights of scrutiny and challenge that apply to leaseholder service charges. That's going to change. So there is going to be scrutiny of service charges in the future, and there is going to be the right for owners of properties to challenge service charges that they think are unreasonable. In that context, we think there is an issue around the fact that obviously if you are connected to the water system in relation to water provided by water companies, you get drinking quality water piped to your home because that's the obligation that the water companies have to provide it to you. In that context, we can see a situation where a resident might say, well, I don't think it's reasonable to charge me extra for example, grey water recycling infrastructure across the development. Why should I pay for that? I'm paying my water rates anyway, and actually, therefore, I don't need to. I can just turn the grey water system off if I don't feel like paying for it. And we think there are some unresolved issues around how we might manage that going forward. But as things stand, these mechanisms exist to allow stewardship bodies to use them to charge for, among other things, the maintenance of grey water infrastructure. I think we did identify that, as Tom has mentioned, there is an issue around actually our water at the moment, when you compare to what other countries pay for their water supply, is comparatively cheap. And there's not a huge amount of incentive on domestic users to make sure they use as little as possible, particularly where it's not metered. So there are some challenges to overcome here, but there are also some legal frameworks that exist to allow us to do what we want to do. Tom, I think I'm coming back to you. Or am I not?
I think that's over to the audience to now ask questions. That's all of our content. Kat, did you want to say anything in wrapping up or sharing the questions?
Sorry, I was struggling to unmute myself. The button wouldn't press. Okay, thank you, Tom and David. Yes, so we've a bit of time for questions now. I've got a few slides just to share at the end about next steps for enabling water smart communities. But yeah, we've got at least 15 minutes for questions now. And indeed, we have one already in the chat in the Q&A, from Paul Reynolds. So, how actively engaged are local people through CLT stewardship model? For example, is it expected that local people will mow the grass in a new development, or is it more of a middleman that issues contracts for maintenance? If the latter, what is the fundamental difference to an estate management company, which can be resident owned? And then he adds, water assets are, I assume, in contrast to cutting the grass, something that requires expert management.
Shall I respond to that? Tom may want to comment on the engagement of local people through the CLT stewardship model. Typically, stewardship bodies of the kind that I've been talking about will contract out at least some of what they do. Some of them will use volunteers as well, but they will use ground maintenance contractors, for example, in relation to estate management. I think the difference between a stewardship trust and a traditional estate management company, first of all, is at governance level. In a stewardship trust, you'll have a broader range of stakeholders engaged. So you might have the local authority, you might have other local third sector organisations, you might have a range of different stakeholders involved in the governance, which I think helps broaden it away from being solely resident focused. The second thing is, as I mentioned at the start, they have a very clear purpose, which is a clear focus on the long-term interests of the wider community. I think the contrast between that and a traditional estate management company is that estate management companies are typically entirely controlled by developers until the development is finished, at which point the developer cuts ties with the management company and walks away. And they are then entirely left to residents to manage without any support from outside stakeholders. And I think the pressure on management companies in that situation is then, over and above everything else, is to keep costs down, to reduce service charges. And that's one of the reasons why standards of maintenance and management vary so significantly under ManCo regimes, and why we think a multi-stakeholder approach with a clear purpose-led aim actually enshrines the broader interests of the community more effectively. And on the last point, I agree. I think water assets would require more technical and expert management than, for example, cutting the grass. Tom, do you want to comment on the CLT stuff there?
Yeah, thanks, David. I suppose to give colour to the explanation you gave of some of the differences. So in the case of the garden village we looked at, the differences are already described, as you described, that the stakeholders are different. So the community land trust is established for the entire parish, incorporating both the red line of the new development and existing residents in the wider area. Some of the people are involved are the head teacher from the local school, sort of drawing on a wider pool of talent and interest in that area. So the purposes of the community land trust are also to, as with all community land trusts, to maintain and develop its assets for the social, economic, and environmental well-being of the community. And it has a sort of more ambitious, future-facing, outward-facing purpose than, as it were, merely cutting the grass and so on. And it involved residents as stakeholders in the process from master planning. It wasn't just residents have nothing to do with it until it's completed, and then those who move in are asked to somehow turn up in the evening to look up, to deal with the management contracts with the grounds maintenance company and so on. So that it's in one sense somewhat similar to a resident management company arrangement, but some of these differences over geography, purpose, governance lead to better outcomes, and that was one of the hypotheses we wanted to test in the earlier research phase of this project. And then the way in which they discharge their responsibilities would largely be, so in this case, the local authority is subcontracted to do all of the ground maintenance on behalf of the CLT, as they will be doing in parks and other places around the district. What we're interested in as well is the extent to which that purpose-led organisation can then lead to greater volunteering opportunities in that, where people do want to get involved in managing assets. And one of the interesting things in the garden village is that there's a new pond, which is put in as part of the balancing pond, part of the water infrastructure, but is also meant to be an amenity. And then some of the residents are unhappy about it because they worry it's a risk their children might fall into the pond and so on. And because you've got this kind of engaged community body with existing and new residents participating in it, they're able to work through some of those challenges and say, well, what do we want to be responsible for? What do we want to go to professionals to manage on our behalf? How do we deal with some of these risks and liabilities? So in those respects, it's not categorically different to a resident management company, but can deal with these sorts of things better and picks up some of the concerns that the Competition and Markets Authority and the government identified with these management company arrangements, which is they often struggle to do a good job. They're not really able to effectively managing agents. There's a real power imbalance. They struggle to get resident directors to volunteer, to want to take on the responsibility. They're often very focused, as David says, merely on understandably keeping bills low, but don't kind of balance that against other considerations.
Thanks, Tom. I've got a bit of a follow-on question, if I may, on that. Just as you were talking about risks and liabilities, I'm thinking with these water systems which require technical expertise, if you're a community stewardship, or what was it called, a guardian body, you don't have the expertise. Where does the kind of accountability and liability lie? So you would maybe contract out for that. Let's say it's a grey water reuse system to be maintained, let's say, by someone else. If it goes wrong, if there are misconnections, where does the accountability or the liability lie? And are there legal tools that you can put around that to protect the kind of community-based organisation?
Shall I pick up the liability point? And the answer to that is that the liability there are mechanisms to allow that to be shared. The first reassurance is that liability shouldn't fall on any individual residents involved in it, because the stewardship body will typically be a limited liability vehicle. So even if the stewardship body were to have a liability in relation to something that happened with, in your example, a grey water recycling asset, that wouldn't fall on individuals. That's why we have limited liability bodies for all sorts of things. But I think it will depend on the terms of the contract between the stewardship body and the contractor who is maintaining that asset. But you would hope that if that contract was drafted correctly, it would pass some of that liability for any issues arising from maintenance or associated issues to the managing body. So it is important that contracts are drafted helpfully and correctly in that sort of context, but normally liability can be managed as an issue.
I think not so much on the not so much on the legal dimension, which David's covered, but you also get to the question of whether the resident directors of these bodies and other stakeholders that are represented on them feel they're equipped with the knowledge and skills to discharge their responsibilities. And that's also, in a sense, where we come in and being able to provide these stewardship bodies with a sort of a peer network and a trade body which they can tap into to help to access that sort of support. And I mentioned about the Guardian role needing access to expertise, and we looked at some of the other partners in the EWSC project bringing their expertise and making that available to this community land trust was great at this point. It would have been better if we had been able to bring that expertise in at an earlier stage. And so there's a question about how we support stewardship bodies, as you say, to have enough. You sort of, the whole thing of you don't know what you don't know. And if you're suddenly presented with an unfamiliar set of technologies that you have some responsibility for, and also if some of the stuff will be, what will the water company be responsible for versus what you're responsible for, and if there are NAVs involved, it could get quite complicated. So you just need a bit of support to be able to navigate that, and then to know what questions you should be asking of your contractors, what you should be ensuring your solicitors put into contracts, and so on.
Yeah. Thank you. And Lena Nieto has put in the chat that parish councils have taken responsibility of maintenance and liability of ponds and water features in the past before management companies. So we've got a few more questions that have come through. Robert says, would it be easier if central government took a lead and fast-tracked legislative and regulatory change to enable water supply companies to supply and charge for grey water? Is there any understanding as to where the blockages... Sorry, there was an extra bit. Is there any understanding as to where the blockages are to making these changes?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I think that at the moment there is some ambiguity or a lack of a framework for water companies to get involved in anything other than the supply of drinking quality water through the mains. So I think if there is the desire to really support the use of grey water recycling, then it'd be good for it to be clear that water companies have the ability to provide and charge for that kind of infrastructure, which simply isn't there at the moment. As to the question about where the blockage is, I think that's a good question. I'm not sure that's one I can answer, whether the colleagues may know more than I do.
I think,
because on this, and there's also a question in the chat about what would government do to scale up water reuse. This is one of the things that the EWSC project more widely has been talking to DEFRA about and looking at. And certainly from the research we did with communities, in the main, they don't want to be responsible for, they'd be happy for a water company to take more ownership of and control of some of this technology. It's not, the open space and green spaces is more in their interest than the kind of pipe work and complex technical systems. So if we could get to the point where the regulatory issues are taken care of, and then also to the point about, it relates to the point about parish councils and what else the government would do. The government's been consulting on how to reduce the prevalence of private management arrangements, and through the EWSC project, we put into submission, and we had a meeting with officials to discuss it, in which we said the position ought to be that it's the default that things either go to an accountable public body like a local council, a parish, town, district, whatever, and they can manage these things properly and are accountable to their residents and a non-profit, or it should go to a non-profit purpose-led community body of whatever kind, and that resident management companies, other arrangements should be a last resort and really should be preserved only for sort of straightforward matters of managing a block of flats and communal areas and so on. And so government in both unblocking some of the opportunities for water companies to be more actively involved, and then working in partnership with stewardship companies, and then for those stewardship bodies and parish and town councils to become the default. Those two things would hugely improve the likelihood that new build development is resulting in well-stewarded water smart communities.
Thanks, Tom. There's a question from Marie about guaranteeing the quality of water infrastructure with poor use of the CDM, that's construction management. Yeah, construction design management. Poor use of CDM in house building. Would the community have the right expertise to spot any issues?
So there's a role here for local authority. So typically, in relation to a stewardship body taking on assets, there will be a process for ensuring and agreeing as part of the planning process that assets are of a particular standard. And we think in that context that, because this is an issue that doesn't just apply to water infrastructure, it applies to any assets that a stewardship body might be asked to take on. We think there's absolutely a mechanism that needs to be in place, both to allow the local authority as the planning authority to ensure that standards are being met as part of the planning consent, but also actually for the stewardship body to be equipped to, if it needs to say no to assets if it can be demonstrated that they don't meet standards. So I think there is a process of ensuring that expertise is available. Obviously, if one of the issues, again, with estate management companies in the past is they haven't had access to that kind of support. So they've been just handed over, bluntly, any old tap in relation to assets developed around properties, and I think haven't had the same ability to both to ensure that assets are of the right standard, which has created all sorts of subsequent issues. So we think that support around that point is critical, absolutely.
Great. And another one from Marie about what resources do the community have to manage capital replacement budgets and sinking funds? Underground suds tanks could cost millions to replace.
This is all part of basically the business planning for the stewardship body, that you're ensuring you're doing a full appraisal of all the assets, the annual maintenance charges, the long-term cyclical work, all that stuff goes into the business planning of whatever assets there are, and comes back to the funding question around how you ensure that body can effectively maintain these things. So it's quite standard to be able to address these. I'd also add, and it sort of partly relates to the question that David just answered, that sometimes I think we treat the term community as though communities are totally skillless, at sea, hopeless individuals. And we all live in communities and we've all got skills. And you can't guarantee this from one community to the next, but it's often interesting to see what kind of people come out of the woodwork and what relevant skills they have. So in the case of the Garden Village, it just so happens that one of the directors of the CLT has a 30+ year career in construction and has been very, very hot on identifying defects and problems with pipework to the school and so on. So, part of it is kind of bringing that extra dimension, that extra dynamic into this process, that you can have people that can bring surprising additional skills and insights into questions of funding and long-term management and so on, which you wouldn't have otherwise. So I think we should be sometimes a bit less distrusting or a bit more, confident in the power and the intelligence of communities to come together to do these things.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got 1 more minute to answer Robert's second question about going back to the issue of liability. Are there challenges in individual households not understanding the significance of their liability? Can you give a 30-second answer to that?
Yes, I mean, I think this is about ground rent point. I take there are some very bad examples around that. I think this is all about having the stewardship body having access to information and ensuring that there is appropriate independent support and advice being provided to that stewardship body. And I take the point, as I say, there have been some very difficult examples in the past, but I think that doesn't undermine the stewardship body approach. It's simply indicative as to why key points support is absolutely imperative.
That's great. Thanks, David. Thanks, Tom. In the last couple of minutes, I'm just going to whiz through next steps on project. If I can just get it to move on. There we go. So the formal Enabling Water Smart Communities project is coming to an end. It's been running for 3 or 4 years, but we are transitioning it into something called a community of practice. And this will build on the active group of stakeholders that we've grown through Enabling Water Smart Communities, and make sure we really do kind of build on that and ensure the delivery of water smart approaches in new developments. So it's going to be managed by SIWEN, which is my organisation, and it's got the 4 objectives that you can see there. I don't want to go into those really now, but just to say, please do, if you want to stay engaged with this work, please do become, if you're not already, if you don't receive our newsletters, please do sign up. It's really important that we have as many kind of different actors representing different interests involved, because we're not going to achieve water smart communities with kind of one sector focus or one sector perspective. So we really do want as many different organisations and people involved. So that, if you want to sign up to our newsletter, that's the QR code there, and that will mean that you stay engaged with this work, which includes, anything that follows on from the community stewardship work. The reports from what David and Tom have talked about should be on the project website. I think there's a link in the chat to them, so you can go and delve into the detail there. And David and I think Tom have said they're very happy if you've got any follow-up questions for you to get in touch. So I think with that, we're done. Thank you very much, David and Tom, for your time, and thank you, all of you, everyone that was involved today and came and listened, for your time. Please stay in touch. All right.